Welcome back, football fans.
Nobody wants to play Chelsea.
When you're sitting second in the Premier League in December, you are definitely in the title race.
Tees up Palmer, third time's a charm. Thrashed in by Cole Palmer, and Chelsea take the lead. Palmer's got it back. Oh my goodness me. Cole Palmer, what have you done now?
Today we dive into the story of how Chelsea went from chaos to clarity, a club that looked broken, confused, and out of ideas, until one man stepped in with a blueprint no one saw coming. Stay with us as we unravel how Enzo Maresca fixed a shattered Chelsea. Chelsea weren't just struggling, they were lost. After spending nearly £1 billion in transfers, the club found themselves mid-table, mocked across Europe for being a super club with no direction. Pochettino's reign ended in tension, fans felt disconnected, and the dressing room was split between overpaid veterans and raw youngsters. The Blues, once feared under Mourinho and admired under Tuchel, had become the Premier League's punchline. The headlines wrote themselves, "Chelsea in crisis. Money can't buy chemistry." Stamford Bridge, once a fortress of fear for opponents, had turned into a stage for frustration, boos, and empty seats. It wasn't just about losing games, it was about losing an identity. Chelsea, a club built on grit, trophies, and a ruthless winning culture, suddenly looked like a collection of expensive strangers. Fans weren't just angry at results, they were embarrassed. Every week they asked the same question: what was this team trying to be? And the truth was, no one had the answer. Not the players, not the owners, not even the managers who came and went like revolving doors. Chelsea were broken, not just in form, but in spirit. That's when Enzo Maresca arrived, a name unfamiliar to most fans, introduced not with fireworks, but with raised eyebrows. Could a coach with only one season of top-flight experience really steady a ship this wrecked? Could someone without the aura of a Klopp, the charisma of a Mourinho, or the CV of a Zidane really survive the storm at Stamford Bridge? Here's what made his challenge almost impossible. He wasn't just tasked with winning games, he had to restore belief. He had to fix the cracks that money couldn't plaster over. He had to give Chelsea something they hadn't had in years, a plan. And that's where this story really begins. When the news broke, most fans had one reaction. Who? Enzo Maresca wasn't a household name. He wasn't a Champions League winner on the touchline. He wasn't even a Tuchel-type big brain hire who had already proven himself at the highest level. He was the assistant who had sat quietly by Pep Guardiola's side, the man who had just guided Leicester City back to the Premier League. To the average Chelsea supporter, he looked more like a gamble than a saviour. But here's the twist. Maresca had something Chelsea desperately lacked: clarity. From the very first press conference, his message was consistent. This wasn't going to be about buying more stars or throwing another billion at the problem. This was about structure, balance, identity. Three things Chelsea had abandoned in their mad rush to rebuild under new ownership. When he walked into Cobham training ground, he inherited a fractured squad. Dozens of signings stacked on top of one another, players with overlapping roles, some who didn't even know their best positions. A dressing room divided between potential and frustration. But Maresca didn't flinch. He wasn't distracted by tabloid noise or the weight of history pressing down on him. Instead, he leaned on something far more powerful: the lessons he had absorbed from Guardiola, the art of positional play, control through possession, patience in the build-up, and above all, the idea that systems, not individuals, win football matches. For Chelsea's players, this was a shock to the system. Training wasn't just about drills anymore. It was football school. Every pass had a purpose. Every movement had an explanation. Maresca broke the game down into geometry and rhythm. Where to stand, when to move, why spacing mattered more than instinct. Some called it obsessive, others whispered that it bordered on overcoaching. But for Chelsea, a team that had been running on chaos, it was exactly what they needed: discipline wrapped inside vision. Fans outside the training ground weren't convinced yet. The skepticism lingered, but inside Cobham, something was shifting. For the first time in years, players began to sense there was a plan, a framework they could trust, and it belonged to Enzo Maresca. Because here's the truth, Chelsea had been living in fragments. Each manager had left behind puzzle pieces from different eras, each signing made with a different system in mind. The result was a squad stitched together with no clear pattern. One game they pressed high, the next they sat deep. One week they looked like Barcelona light, the next like Stoke City on a bad day. Possession became meaningless. Attacks looked improvised, like players trying to invent ideas on the fly. Defending relied more on luck than coordination. Chelsea weren't a team, they were an expensive experiment gone wrong. Maresca spotted this from day one, and his solution wasn't to demand another superstar or rip the squad apart again. His answer was much simpler, but far more powerful: identity. He wanted Chelsea to play with a defined purpose, something they hadn't had since the prime Mourinho era, or briefly under Tuchel's Champions League run. A system every player could plug into, regardless of flair or reputation. And that's when the repair work truly began. Step 1 was clarity. For the first time in years, every player had a defined role. Wingers weren't just told to run and cross like robots. Midfielders weren't left as anonymous bodies shuffling around the center of the pitch. Even defenders weren't just blockers anymore. They were active parts of the build-up, tasked with specific patterns of play. Every movement was intentional, every action rehearsed until it felt instinctive. Maresca wanted Chelsea to control games not by overwhelming opponents with raw pace or moments of individual brilliance, but by suffocating them with structure. Step 2 was patience. This was the hardest part for the fans. Chelsea supporters had been conditioned by years of chaos. Managers fired after a bad run, players signed in desperation, the expectation that money could shortcut any problem. Buy now, win now had become the culture. But Maresca wasn't building quick highlights, he was building habits, repetition, muscle memory. Slowly, those habits turned into patterns. The aim wasn't instant fireworks, it was to light a steady flame that would keep burning. And as weeks passed, Chelsea began to look less like 11 strangers and more like a functioning unit again. And step 3, confidence. For a squad that had been torn apart in headlines, ridiculed as flops, and written off as transfer mistakes, Maresca's system gave them something priceless: purpose. Suddenly, the same players who looked lost under previous managers began to shine. Not because they had magically transformed overnight, but because, for the first time in years, they actually knew what to do on the pitch. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't instant, but it was working. Chelsea weren't chasing moments anymore. They were building an identity brick by brick. When people talk about Enzo Maresca, one name always comes up: Pep Guardiola. And it's not hard to see why. Maresca played under Pep, studied his methods, and worked alongside him at Manchester City. That education shaped everything about how he views football. The obsession with control, the positional play, the belief that systems outlast stars. But here's the critical point: Maresca isn't just copying Guardiola, he's adapting him. Pep's philosophy has always been about domination. Keep the ball, stretch the field, and suffocate the opponent with relentless pressure. Maresca absorbed those ideas, then asked the essential question: how do I translate this for Chelsea's broken squad? At Leicester, he experimented. Fullbacks stepping into midfield to create overloads. Wingers hugging the touchline to stretch defenses. Midfielders rotating endlessly to always provide an option. That blueprint delivered him a championship title and promotion. But Chelsea, this wasn't the championship. This was a fractured giant, a dressing room full of expensive, fragile egos. This was the real test. So he brought Guardiola's principles, but bent them to Chelsea's reality. With Enzo Fernandez and Moises Caicedo, he constructed a midfield designed to dictate tempo, to keep the game in Chelsea's hands. With Cole Palmer, he unlocked a playmaker between the lines, a young talent who thrived in tight spaces and gave Chelsea the creativity they had sorely lacked. And instead of forcing the team into one rigid mold, Maresca allowed tactical flexibility, sometimes a 4-3-3, sometimes morphing into a 4-3-2, 3-2-5 in possession, depending on the situation. You could see the influence everywhere, triangles forming across the pitch, passing sequences drilled until they became second nature. defenders brave enough to invite pressure, then break it with precision. Suddenly, Chelsea weren't running after the ball, they were dictating it. They weren't panicking when pressed. They were luring opponents in, then escaping with intelligence. This wasn't Pep's City, it was Maresca's Chelsea, but the DNA was visible. And for the first time in years, Stamford Bridge watched a team that actually looked like it knew what it wanted to be. Because here's the thing about Chelsea, after the eras of Lampard, Tuchel, Potter, and Pochettino, this wasn't just a team low on results. It was a team stripped of belief. Players looked nervous on the ball, second-guessing every decision. The dressing room felt fractured, split between new signings and old guard. Every mistake wasn't just a setback, it was an earthquake that triggered panic. And that's where Maresca's real challenge began, because tactics can only take you so far. You can draw every line on a tactics board, you can teach every movement on the training ground, but if your squad doesn't believe in itself, if they don't trust the system and trust each other, the game is already lost before kickoff. Maresca approached it differently. He didn't storm in with shouting or empty slogans. He created clarity. Training was structured, roles were defined, and for the first time in a long time, Chelsea's players weren't second-guessing themselves on the pitch. When you know exactly where your teammate will be, confidence builds automatically. But mentality isn't just about drills, it's about trust. Maresca made players feel valued again. He gave young stars like Cole Palmer and Levi Colwill responsibility instead of protecting them. He demanded accountability, but also patience. The message was clear. Mistakes happen, but identity stays the same. Slowly, the panic football disappeared. Instead of collapsing after conceding, Chelsea started fighting back. Instead of shrinking under pressure, players started taking ownership. The energy at Stamford Bridge shifted. Fans could feel it, opponents could sense it, and the squad began to carry itself like a team again, not a collection of overpriced signings. This wasn't just tactical coaching, it was psychological repair, and without it, Chelsea's revival would never have started. Every great revival needs a centerpiece. For Maresca's Chelsea, that figure wasn't a £100 million signing or a grizzled veteran, it was Cole Palmer. A player Manchester City let go for £40 million, and a player many thought wasn't ready for the spotlight. But Maresca saw it differently. To him, Palmer wasn't just another winger or midfielder. He was the heartbeat Chelsea had been missing. Calm under pressure, intelligent with the ball, and ruthless in the final third. The kind of player who doesn't just execute a system, but elevates it. The plan was simple, but bold. Make Palmer the hub. Instead of hiding behind senior players, he was given freedom to roam between lines, drop into midfield, and dictate the tempo. Suddenly, Chelsea's chaotic attack had structure, passes had purpose, runs had timing, and here's what made it click. Palmer thrived under responsibility. Where others froze in front of goal, he stepped up. Where others hesitated, he demanded the ball. Week after week, he became Chelsea's most reliable outlet, turning half chances into goals and nervous fans into believers. In many ways, Maresca's biggest signing wasn't anyone bought in the transfer market, it was the decision to hand the keys of the attack to Palmer. That trust didn't just unlock a player, it began unlocking the entire squad. Because when one leader rises, others follow, and Chelsea finally had a talisman to rally around. If you watch Chelsea under Enzo Maresca and feel echoes of Manchester City, you're not imagining it. Maresca spent time under Pep Guardiola at City, learning not just the formations but the philosophy. Football as control, as patience, as inevitability. For years, Chelsea's play had been frantic. Attacks broke down, defenses panicked, and possession often felt like a burden instead of a weapon. Maresca flipped that script. His Chelsea began moving like chess pieces, not scattered pawns. Every pass had a purpose, every rotation was rehearsed. The fingerprints of Guardiola's school were everywhere. Full-backs stepping into midfield, wingers stretching the pitch, and midfielders dictating tempo in pockets of space that didn't even exist before the movement created them. It wasn't about 90 minutes of chaos, it was about 90 minutes of control. But here's the difference, Maresca didn't just copy Pep. He adapted it. Chelsea's squad wasn't built with a Kevin De Bruyne or an Erling Haaland, so Maresca leaned on versatility. Instead of demanding players fit the system, he bent the system just enough to fit the players. Palmer became the free creator. Gallagher turned into a relentless presser. Even defenders were encouraged to step into midfield and break lines with courage. The result? For the first time in years, Chelsea looked like a team with an identity. Not just a collection of expensive names, but a unit with a plan. And that plan was working. Numbers don't lie, and neither do performances. When Maresca took over, Chelsea weren't feared. They were pitied. A club once defined by trophies had become a punchline, stuck in mid-table obscurity. But under Maresca, something shifted. The first sign wasn't just in the scorelines, it was in the body language. Players who looked lost under previous managers started playing with belief. The midfield stopped leaking control. The defense stopped panicking every time the opposition pressed. Even when Chelsea didn't dominate, they looked like a side with direction. Statistically, the improvements were sharp. Possession numbers climbed. Passing accuracy rose. The number of shots created per match spiked. And slowly, the results followed. What used to be nervy 1-1 draws turned into confident 2-0 wins. Games that once slipped away in the final 10 minutes were now closed out with composure. But beyond the data, the eye test told the real story. Stamford Bridge, which had been drowning in frustration, began to buzz again. Fans who had stopped believing started singing louder, staying longer, and, most importantly, trusting again. From mid-table mediocrity, Chelsea were pushing back toward the conversation of European places. And not through luck, but through structure. Through a manager who gave the club something it had been missing for years: consistency. Here's the thing. Football isn't just about tactics, formations, or numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about connection. And for a while, Chelsea fans felt cut off from their own club. Years of chaos, managers fired, players underperforming, promises broken, left Stamford Bridge more like a theatre of frustration than a fortress. Maresca's biggest win wasn't just in the results, it was in repairing that bond. From day one, his message was clear. The fans aren't passengers, they're part of the engine. His football wasn't designed just to win matches, but to give people something worth believing in again. You could see it in the atmosphere. Games that once felt flat were alive with energy. The songs rang louder, not because Chelsea were dominating every opponent, but because supporters saw effort, purpose, and identity on the pitch. It felt like their Chelsea again, organised, fearless, and playing with pride. Even the younger fans, kids who had only known the post-Abramovich chaos, were finally seeing what it meant when the club stood tall. And older fans, hardened by years of glory, could recognize that while this wasn't a finished product, it was at least a project worth investing their hearts into. By restoring trust, Maresca didn't just fix a broken squad, he relit the fire in the stands. And once Stamford Bridge is roaring again, Chelsea stop being just a team. They become a force. Every manager who walks through the doors at Cobham dreams of leaving a legacy. But the truth is, few ever do. At Chelsea, the cycle has been brutal. Short reigns, quick fixes, and a revolving door that turned the club into a headline factory rather than a dynasty builder. But here's what makes Maresca different. He isn't chasing instant glory. He's building something designed to last. His tactics aren't gimmicks. They're rooted in teaching, in discipline, in a structure that young players can grow inside for years. That's why so many analysts compare his project to what Arteta built at Arsenal, or even Guardiola at City. It's not about a single season, it's about a philosophy. If it succeeds, Maresca could mark the end of Chelsea's chaos era and the beginning of something far more powerful: stability. That's a word that hasn't lived at Stamford Bridge for decades, and if fans, players, and the board give him the time he needs, his name won't just be remembered as a manager who stopped the bleeding, it'll be remembered as the one who rewrote the future. Because legacies aren't built in transfer windows, they're built in belief, in patience, and in turning broken teams into believers. And right now, Chelsea believe again. So here's the truth. Chelsea weren't just broken, they were directionless. £1 billion spent, countless managers fired, and the fan base left asking if the glory days were gone forever. And then came Enzo Maresca, not a flashy name, not a superstar manager, but someone with a vision sharp enough to cut through the chaos. He didn't fix Chelsea overnight. He rebuilt the foundations, one pass, one press, one belief at a time. And now, for the first time in years, the Blues don't just look like a team, they look like a project, a story worth believing in. But the bigger question is this: can Maresca truly finish what he started? Can he turn a club that's been addicted to instant success into one that finally embraces patience, growth, and legacy? That's where you come in. What do you think? Will Enzo Maresca be remembered as the man who rebuilt Chelsea, or just another name in the revolving door? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story isn't finished yet. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started with more stories from the world of football you won't want to miss.